Cool. So the main thesis of my talk is going to be that every live game is fundamentally a content treadmill. This can actually also apply to franchises, and if you think of releases as content updates. So every new game is kind of part of that franchise. And I'm going to treat this statement as a universal psychological fundamental truth. But if you showed this to a psychologist, they probably wouldn't say it quite like this. They would instead talk about novelty, not novelty in the superficial, oh, this is new to me, but novelty in terms of stimulus that my brain needs to process. They'd also probably cross this out to engagement, and engagement is really just sustained attention. So we live now in an engagement economy. Attention is bought and sold. We literally pay in attention. So it's really, really important to know kind of how to grab attention and to understand what novelty and new stimulus means. So we adapted to be attentive to new things in our environment for very important reasons. It's an evolutionary adaptation to living in a world with things like this, where if you don't pay attention to this, you're probably going to be dead, and that is sad. So you've probably heard the 3 standard lizard brain tests. Can I eat it, can I have sex with it, and will it kill me? And if any of those 3 are even remotely true, you are going to pay attention to it. You can, in fact, not help paying attention to it. But that's not the only thing that gets attention. That gets a very superficial level of attention, and it doesn't really sustain it. Once I've processed, yes, I can eat this or not, I don't really care. So our attention is also tuned to things that are a little bit more cognitive and higher level. So has anyone seen this puzzle before? I'm just going to leave this puzzle up here for a second. You can see that both triangles are 5 units high and 13 units long. They're both made of the exact same 4 pieces. The red triangles and blue triangles are identical, and the orange and green Oklahoma shapes are also identical. Now, why did this keep my attention? So I have this mental model that I've developed about how the world works over the course of my decades of being a human being on this earth. And in my mental model of how the world works, triangles that have the same width and height have the same area. So why is it that one of these triangles has 1 square unit less area? This was frustrating to me. This was called cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance is what happens when you get a stimulus that you cannot fit into your perception of how the world works. It's very frustrating and it's very uncomfortable for us. It's why we only watch the news channels that agree with how we see the world. And there's all sorts of other tricks that our brains put up to make sure that we stay happy and that everything resonates with our cognitive model. We're incredibly biased. Has anyone figured this out yet? I'm not going to tell you the answer, but if you want, you can tweet at me. So this is like higher level engagement, and this is called paradox. It's when we put 2 dissimilar things together, and our brains kind of naturally want to connect them. We love connecting things. We love making sense. This is one small part of a bigger theory called enchantment that I'm not going to talk about, but if you guys like homework, I highly recommend it. Yeah, so you have kind of low-level attention and higher-level attention. But the point is that you pay attention to things that are important to you. We love engaging with new content. We love engaging with new stimulus. We love seeing something and having to process it. And so let's talk about what that looks like a little bit deeper. So you guys have all probably, if you've been into the neuropsychology section, heard about our dopamine cycles. And dopamine is what makes us seek out new information. So when you think about getting to new stimulus and you think about what an engagement cycle looks like, you've kind of got these peaks and valleys. So we're seeking out stimulus, we're seeking it out, we get it, and then we savor it. And of course, our attention spans right now are so tuned to rapid stimuli, this actually looks much more like a saw wave. We get that stimulus, and then we immediately start seeking again. It's not this nice sinusoidal curve. And this is actually what playing a game looks like. So if you think about Flappy Bird, this cycle happens many, many, many times a minute. Every time I tap, I get a stimulus. I get either +1 point, or I get a bird on the bottom of the screen dead, and I have to start over. So that's an engagement cycle. That's kind of like I'm going to go back to rhythm, he's gone. That's like the rhythm of the game. It's a very, very rapid rhythm. So that's all well and good, but unfortunately those quick, rapid, repeated rhythms aren't optimal for engagement. This is the flow curve. Flow is a super basic optimal engagement theory that talks about kind of what level of stimulus you want to have to keep players engaged. Basically, don't make it too easy and don't make it too hard. But as you can see, it needs to increase over time because we are getting skill over time. And if you think about that in terms of attention, we are processing information over time. So as we process information, we need stuff that is increasingly more interesting, more compelling. It's new strategy, it mixes it up. So we can't just have that quick moment-to-moment gameplay. That's why Flappy Bird died out, is because there was nothing cumulative about that. There was nothing that was getting increasingly more interesting. Once I learned it, once I'd figured out the system, it was kind of over and done. And you can see that in performance on the charts. So how do we get these curves? These curves that go up and to the right. What we can do is we can layer our engagement rhythms. So instead of just having that really nice, juicy moment-to-moment gameplay, we can wrap longer-term engagement cycles on top of that. So as I'm doing these moment-to-moment things, they're adding up to something bigger. Okay, so that's kind of the underlying psychology behind all of this, and now I'm going to talk about what this actually looks like in games. So if we want to optimize to get that nice escalating series of curves, we have to do two things. The first thing we have to do is figure out how to design those longer-term cycles, because you don't see them in very many games. You usually see moment-to-moment gameplay and day-to-day gameplay, but there's not a lot of games that get that longer-term gameplay really well. And the other thing that we want to talk about doing is how to offload all of that content from the developer's shoulders, because that's not really sustainable. The most sustainable game is one that can get increasingly more interesting without you having to ever lift a finger. So that's what we're going to aim for. So first, let's talk about designing across timescale. So, and this just essentially means make sure that you have the little pieces, the little moment-to-moment, and also the daily, the weekly, and the monthly engagement. So here's some examples of how to get longer cycle rhythms. These are 3 examples of time-based longer-term engagement from some of my favorite games. Rest in peace, Glitch, down at the bottom there. So the 2 of these up at the top, the one on the right is Travian. And Travian actually has a full game meta cycle. So I don't know how many of you guys have played Travian, but a Travian server, a Travian game, lasts for about 300 days, at which point the world ends. So every day I come in and I harvest my resources, and I do this every day for the whole year. But as I'm doing it, the end game triggers are starting to show up. The alliances are starting to form. People are taking over the world. I'm getting more powerful, and I know that there's this imminent threat of danger, and we either have to build our monumental wonder, or we're going to get taken over by this invasion force. So that's a year-long kind of cycle of engagement, and this is the only game that I know that has that long-term, built-in designed cycle to keep people engaged. The one on the left is from a game called Flight Rising, which is just a pet breeding simulator with dragons. And the cooldown period for some of the rarest types of pets that you can breed is 35 days. So that's a month. That's a month of time that people have to wait in between this stimulus of getting new dragons. And they're all genetic, so it's a random pull, and it's very exciting. So that's pretty hard to pull off. And what I want to see is I want to see more games building in these longer-term cycles so that as people are doing the grind, they're getting more out of it over time. They're approaching these really climactic moments. Another way to do this that's less time-related is having bigger aspirational progress bars. So these are things like mastering your collection book. In Farmville, we had things called crop mastery. So every time you mastered a crop, which usually entailed planting tens of thousands of the same thing over and over and over again, we would give you a 100 by 100 pixel sign that you could display that said you spent a shit ton of time planting this crop. And people loved this. This was the biggest social status symbol that Farmville had at the time. People loved hunting after these. If you went to someone's farm and you saw that they had all of these mastering signs, you knew that this person was one of the best, quote unquote, best Farmville players in the game. It was very, very compelling for people. And again, as they're just doing their daily routine, as they're planting their 12 hours of sunflowers, it's starting to add up. So it doesn't die off. That novelty continues as we get closer to this approach of getting the sign. 2 caveats. The first one is verisimilitude. And verisimilitude is essentially how well your mechanics match with your world. In the case of Flight Rising, it's a 35-day timer. That's over a month that people have to wait, and they don't care. And part of the reason that they don't care is that it makes sense. Animals can't repeatedly reproduce. It's not physically possible. It makes sense with the world. People are much more willing to digest that and accept it, and less likely to say you're an evil, money-grubbing bastard. So, On the other hand, you have things like your classic energy timers, and oftentimes those don't actually make sense with the world. They feel tacked on. They feel like an artificial constraint. If you're going to have timers, make sure that the theme of your game makes that make sense. There should always be a reason. It should always be justified. Second caveat, integrity. The moment that Farmville released Instagrow, which was the ability to fast finish your crops, the value of these signs plummeted, and people were no longer willing to chase them. So all of our long-term players, all of our the best players who are championing this game, who are sending it out to all of their friends, all of our social whales, suddenly lost this thing that they'd invested hugely in, and were much less likely to continue feeling like the grind was worthwhile. All right, next really good way to get long-term cycles into your game. Serial narrative. So if you think about soap operas, if you think about cyclical plays, episodic content has been around forever and ever and ever. And what I don't see is games really utilizing it. Games aren't good storytellers, especially infinite games, especially freemium games. It's hard to tell a compelling story within the context of an infinite game. Two games that do it really well, Walking Dead and Pixelberry Studios' High School Story. So I started playing High School Story about a year ago, and they have one kind of overarching plot. So they, of course, have all of their classic daily quests, but they have one overarching plot that involves this immense backstabbing drama, and you're trying to figure out who is responsible for it. And trying to figure out who is responsible for it took me 7 months. So 7 months for an average engaged player, just about 3 sessions a day, to figure out who did this. And I was so compelled to figure out who did this. We are social creatures. We are dramatic creatures. We want to know. We want to learn more. So that's a 7-month cycle that they built into their average quest log. Everything was adding up. I wanted to stay engaged. I was compelled. Okay, there's a little bit more coming, but first we're going to jump back to our other thread. So how do we make sure that all of this new content is great and fine and dandy, and we're going to design as systemically as we can for it, but we still don't want it to all be on our shoulders? That's unsustainable. So content can come from 3 basic places. It can come from devs, it can come from chance, or it can come from other players. So games where the content comes solely from the developers. This is really good if you have a great brand. If you have a great brand, you probably have to control what's in your game pretty tightly. But this comes at a cost of long-term sustainability. People continue to need new content updates, and that content has to come from you, and that content has to be increasingly compelling, which usually means you need more resources to do it. So as your game is aging and naturally declining, the resources that you need to maintain engagement are increasing, and you essentially get into this very sad place where you're stuck needing more to do less. The next one is chance. So chance is a little bit better. And chance is seeded by devs, so it's not like we're going to get ourselves off the hook entirely. But chance makes everything a little bit variable. It means that it's a little bit different. And this is all of your procedural gameplay. So every time I play a Candy Crush level, it's not quite the same as the last time that I played it. The pieces that fall are a little bit different. When I go into Minecraft, I'm going into a world that no one has ever seen before, assuming I start with a random seed. That's compelling because I know there's going to be new stuff to process. I know that there's going to be things that I can't imagine, and probably that the devs couldn't even imagine. They've unlocked this repeatability, this replay value that we don't usually see in most games. And I have Farmville there for the sheep breeding mechanic, because that lets you mix HTML color hex codes on your sheep and lets you kind of breed them infinitely. And the best thing, the most sustainable thing that you can do is have the content come from other players. And this isn't like gifting, right? Gifting isn't compelling content. What I mean is that the fundamental challenge, the fundamental expenditure of skill, the fundamental joy of your game comes from other people. So if you think about the games that have survived for centuries, if not millennia, things like Go and chess, those games are interesting because every time I sit down to play it, it's a different game. Even if I'm playing with the same person, that person has changed since the last game. That person has learned things. They are the most nuanced AI that we have on this earth, other people. And they're basically an infinite variable. Anytime that I go up against a person, it's going to be a little bit different. And sometimes you have them create actual literal physical content, right? Every single player who plays Clash of Clans is a level designer. They have millions of level designers for their game. Wouldn't that be nice if we could all just have millions of level designers, millions of little content creators? We can if we design our systems smartly. Really? I should not have 10 minutes left. That's okay. All right. If we design our system smartly, we can make sure that every person who plays is a little tiny content generator. So now let's combine those two things, long-term cycles and other players. So if you were anywhere near any gaming media a few months ago, then you heard about a battle in EVE Online that cost its players $300,000. If you dug a little bit past the headline, you realize that this event happened not because the devs were like, crap, our DAU's down, we got to put out a new event. It happened because one person in one alliance forgot to continue their automatic payments. And what this did was it catalyzed a series of events that the developers could never have anticipated based on the social structures that people created in EVE over time. So they basically had a little space station that was in a very strategic part of space. It suddenly became available for the taking, and two of the biggest alliances in the game both went after it and began fighting. And this fighting lasted for days. And that was all basically user-generated content. So again, it's not about gifting, it's about letting people provide the challenge, and then the higher step is to actually let players self-organize. So let players create their own social structures, because those social structures, those clans, those guilds, are basically little gameplay worlds, and people can keep themselves entertained within those worlds, completely separate from what you've already accomplished in your game, completely separate from the mechanics. As the previous talk was mentioned, once we get into a guild and we're invested in it, they become friends, and we become much more willing to spend to make our friends happy. We become much more likely to stay around just to hang out with our friends, even if the game is boring to us already. Social interaction is like steroids for your metrics. It's one of the most powerful things that you can include as long as people can interact and organize. And there are a bunch of prerequisites for organization, like communication, the ability to express themselves, right? If you don't have a chat, if you don't have a way for people to communicate, they're not going to be able to organize, and they're not going to be able to do anything meaningful. So this isn't, this is a non-trivial ad, but it's incredibly worthwhile. Okay. So if you want to make your game as sustainable as possible, if you want to get yourself as far off the treadmill as you can, think about the underlying psychology. Think about how you're bringing new things to your players, not just from a superficial novelty perspective, but what are new things that are changing the game, that are making it more interesting, that are making people rethink their mental models of how your game works and what's fun about it. Design across timescale. So yes, have those wonderfully juicy moment-to-moment gameplay, but make sure that it adds up into something bigger over time. If it doesn't, people are going to get bored. And this can be as simple as working up this, epic leaderboard. It doesn't matter, it just has to be cumulative over time. And try to design for longer than what you see most games doing. Design for 2 years out. Like, people don't do that. And imagine if they did. Imagine what kind of games we could make that could last for decades. And then enable your players to be content creators. Enable them to challenge each other in really meaningful ways. Allow them to create their own social structures, their own friend groups, their own clans and guilds. Allow them to organize, and you've got a game that can last forever. Thanks.
Hi, this is a really great talk. I actually wrote a game that's doing just that in terms of allowing players to create levels, which is Project Spark, and it's just a really smart idea. But I wanted to talk to you about the, in 30 days you'll have a dragon, and how exactly does just that engage players? I mean, they're not really engaged in waiting for anything. Is it just the promise of the future?
So that's why you need to have both, right? You need to have the moment-to-moment and the daily things that keep you entertained while you're waiting for that bigger thing. So that's not the only mechanic. I've also got multiple lines of that. So I might have 6 pairs of dragons that are waiting to breed, and they come in cyclically. So maybe every 5 days I'll get one of those moments, but it lasts longer. And then I've got my daily things, so I can go in and I can collect resources every day. There's all sorts of daily things to do. But yeah, long-term alone is not going to sustain people. You have to have immediate, you have to have short-term, mid-term, long-term. You have to have all of those cycles that are going to add up over time. So the actual hatching moment is the stimulus. That's the, oh, what did I get? This thing's going to happen. I'm really excited. Part of that is because the hatchlings that you get are random, so you don't know what's going to pop out. So it's like, great, this new thing, fantastic. But part of it's just that having to wait and knowing that something is going to happen. Even if I know what that is, like even if all that does is it unlocks my ability to buy another dragon, like that's still exciting because now it has gameplay relevance.
Anyone else? Yep.
Hi, great talk. I had a question about governance and how you would look at content creation by users. EVE is a great example of how it can go right, but there have been cases in the past, like Knights Online, where the players have all but mutinied against developers. So at what point do you step in to say, like, hey, this is getting too far off the rails, or do you let the players kind of just go indefinitely make the game they want? When do you kind of step in, and how do you address governance in this?
Oh, so that's super interesting. I think that completely depends on what the design guidelines for your game are. I think that EVE got it right because their audience is an incredibly hardcore audience that is capable of being cohesive even with all of the variables that they have to think about, like to the point where, you know, one person not paying rent is going to start a war, right? That's not something that a casual social collective is going to want to think about. So it really depends on, like, if you're doing something that's much more casual, you wouldn't want to give people the ability to create massive corporations that have, like, banks and all of that, like, associated economic stuff. You'd want it to be much more simpler. But even if you think about, like, MUDs are a great example of, like, lightweight mechanics that let people create their own thing. And there are MUDs that are still going on. And I think that you can have very restrictive mechanics as long as there's an ability to communicate and some way to perform collective action. Those are the two kind of key points. And even if that action is small, if it's expressive, you can keep it within your design kind of bubble pretty nicely without worrying about chaos, which is a very valid fear.
Thanks again for a great talk. I'm curious if you have any sort of thoughts on what the simplest game you've ever seen that is capable of this long-term evolution. And I was just trying to think myself, and obviously, like, multiplayer games are probably the ones that are going to have it, but can you think of anything that's single player that's capable of this?
So I still know a few people playing Candy Clicker, or Cookie Clicker, not Candy, the Candy Box Evolution Cookie Clicker. I think they're weird, and it's very atypical. But that's an example of literally like Progress Quest, kind of. Progress Quest has those stacking progress bars, and some of them are 3 minutes and 5 minutes, and some of them are 2 weeks. And it's like that's the completely stripped down bare bones mechanic, right? Is stacked progress bars. That's really all it boils down to. I think that unless you have that variability that social adds, there's very few people who are going to continue to be interested in Progress Quest when the progress bars start getting to the, like, 3-week mark, you know?
Any others? No, seems
Awesome.